The battlefield was nothing but fire and death. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking, as distant explosions rumbled across the shattered landscape. Sergeant Jack Carter moved carefully through the ruins of what had once been an enemy outpost, his rifle raised, eyes scanning the wreckage. His squad was gone, wiped out in the last ambush. He had no way of knowing if command even realized he was still alive. All he had now was his training, his instincts, and the faint hope that he could make it back to friendly lines before nightfall. The war between humanity and the alien empire had raged for years. No one really understood how it started anymore, only that peace had never been an option. The aliens were ruthless, their technology superior, their soldiers relentless. But humans had learned to fight back, to adapt, to survive. And Jack was a survivor. He had to be. His boots crunched over broken metal and shattered concrete as he moved through the wreckage. The battle had been over for hours, yet the silence was unnerving. No bodies, no movement, just the lingering scent of charred flesh and burnt circuitry. He had to find shelter, something, anything, to regroup. Then he heard it, a faint noise, barely more than a whisper against the wind, a sharp intake of breath, ragged and strained. Jack froze, his grip tightening on his rifle. Slowly, he turned toward the source of the sound, his eyes narrowing at a half-buried escape pod lodged against the ruins. The outer shell was cracked, deep gouges torn into the metal, smoke still seeping from the edges. Another sound. This time, a weak cough. Someone was inside. Jack hesitated. It could be a trap. It could be an enemy soldier waiting for the right moment to strike. But something about the sound didn't sit right. It wasn't the growling language of the alien warriors he had fought before. It was softer, weaker. He stepped closer, weapon raised, his heart pounding. The pod's emergency hatch was half open, the dim glow of failing lights flickering within. He could see movement inside, small, unsteady. Not a soldier, not a warrior, something else. With careful precision, he reached forward and pulled the hatch open the rest of the way. Inside, slumped against the curved wall, was an alien unlike any he had ever seen. Her skin, a strange shade of iridescent blue, was smeared with dark blood, her breathing shallow. The thin, tattered robe clung to her slender frame, torn in places, revealing deep gashes along her arms and side. A thin circlet, cracked and barely holding together, rested on her forehead. Royal insignia. Jack's stomach twisted. This wasn't just any alien. This was someone important, someone powerful. And if she was here, that meant someone was looking for her. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then widening in alarm. She tried to move, but pain racked her body, forcing a weak gasp from her lips. She wasn't a threat. Not now, at least. But that could change. Jack took a step back, gun still trained on her. "Don't move," he said, his voice steady. She flinched at the sound, her breathing growing more erratic. She didn't understand him. Or maybe she did, but was too weak to respond. Either way, it didn't matter. He had a decision to make. Leave her and save himself, or stay and risk everything. The distant sound of approaching engines made the choice for him. Someone was coming. Fast. Cursing under his breath, Jack slung his rifle over his shoulder and reached down, grabbing the alien girl under her arms. She gasped in protest, too weak to fight back as he hauled her out of the pod. She was lighter than he expected, but the tension in her body told him she was terrified. Yeah, he muttered, glancing at the horizon where dark figures were beginning to appear. "You're not the only one having a bad day." With one last look at the burning wreckage, Jack hoisted her onto his back and disappeared into the ruins. The bunker was dark, damp, and smelled of rust and decay. Jack Carter moved quickly, his steps careful as he pushed through the narrow, crumbling passageway. The alien girl was still slung over his back, her breathing shallow against his shoulder. Every few steps, she let out a weak sound, something between a whimper and a gasp. But she didn't struggle. She was too far gone for that. He reached the main chamber of the ruined bunker and kicked aside debris, clearing a space near the farthest wall. Carefully, he lowered her down, her limp form barely reacting as he leaned her against the cold metal. His hands were already moving, tearing open a pouch from his belt, searching for medical supplies. He wasn't a medic, but he knew how to patch wounds, at least human wounds. Jack flicked on a dim flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the darkness. That was when he saw her properly for the first time. She wasn't like the alien warriors he had fought before. They were towering, monstrous things, clad in heavy armor, their eyes cold and merciless. But she was different, smaller, fragile-looking. Her deep blue skin had an unnatural shimmer to it, like polished metal under moonlight. Her silver hair, tangled and matted with blood, fell over her face, partially hiding the delicate ridges along her forehead. Her features were sharp, but not inhuman. In fact, if not for the eerie glow of her half-open eyes, she might have passed for something out of an old myth, an elf, a ghost, something ethereal and otherworldly. His gaze moved to the deep gash on her side, the dark blood still seeping from the wound. Whatever her physiology was, she was still bleeding, and that meant she could still die. He pulled out a sterilized cloth and pressed it against her side, applying pressure. She flinched, a weak pain sound escaping her lips. "Yeah, I know," Jack muttered. "Hurts like hell, doesn't it?" Her eyelids flickered, her breathing unsteady. Then, to his surprise, she muttered something, her voice weak but clear. Human. Jack froze. She spoke English. No, not quite. Her accent was strange. The syllables stretched, the pronunciation off. But she understood what he was. "Yeah," he said cautiously. "Human. And you're lucky I found you before your own people did." Her breathing hitched. She tried to sit up, but her body failed her, and she slumped back against the wall. Her gaze locked onto him now, no longer hazy with pain, but filled with something else. "Fear. Kill me," she whispered. Jack exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't have carried you halfway across this wasteland." She stared at him, her glowing eyes narrowing, as if trying to process his words. Then she blinked, her fingers twitching slightly before she winced. Jack kept working, tying a makeshift bandage around her wound. His supplies weren't great, but they would keep her alive for now. Then suddenly, a faint beeping sound filled the air. Jack's head snapped up. The alien girl's eyes widened in horror. The sound was coming from her suit. Jack didn't hesitate. He reached forward and tore at the fabric, yanking a small glowing device from the folds near her waist. A distress beacon. It had been activated, probably triggered automatically when her vitals dropped. And that meant someone was already on their way. "Damn it," Jack muttered. He crushed the device under his boot. But it was too late. The signal had already been sent. The alien girl struggled to speak, her breath coming fast now. "They coming." "Yeah," Jack said grimly, his jaw tightening. "I figured." He grabbed his rifle and peered out the small opening of the bunker. The horizon was still dark, but something flickered in the distance. Movement. Ships, maybe. Or something worse. He turned back to the girl. She was watching him now, not just with fear, but with something else. A question. Jack sighed. "Looks like we're both in trouble now, Princess." Her eyes widened at the word. Jack slung his rifle over his shoulder and checked his ammo. Whatever was coming, it would be here soon. He had a feeling this was only the beginning. Jack Carter kept his rifle close as he crouched near the bunker's entrance, eyes fixed on the horizon. The sky was dark, but the distant glow of approaching lights told him everything he needed to know. Someone had received that distress signal. Someone was coming. The question was, who? Behind him, the alien girl stirred, still weak from blood loss, but awake enough to know what was happening. She didn't speak, didn't move much, but Jack could feel her watching him. The tension in the room was thick, unspoken questions hanging in the air. He didn't have time for questions. Reaching into his vest, he pulled out a small pair of binoculars and lifted them to his eyes. His gut twisted. He could see the outlines of figures moving across the wasteland, sleek armor catching the dim light. Not humans, alien soldiers, and they were moving fast. Jack muttered a curse. He turned back to the girl, who was struggling to sit up, her expression tight with pain. She was still weak, but there was something sharp in her gaze now. Awareness, urgency. She knew what was coming. "Your people?" Jack asked, nodding toward the approaching figures. Her glowing eyes flickered. She hesitated, then gave a small shake of her head. Not her people. That meant only one other possibility. "Not good," Jack muttered. She swallowed hard, her breathing shallow. "They hunt." Jack narrowed his eyes. He had seen aliens fight before. They were brutal, efficient, and had no hesitation in wiping out human squads. But something in her voice made him pause. There was more to this. "Who are they hunting?" he asked carefully. She didn't answer at first. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "Me." Jack exhaled through his nose. He had figured as much, but hearing it confirmed changed things. He had assumed this was a standard retrieval mission, maybe an elite squad coming to rescue a stranded VIP. But this wasn't a rescue. It was a hunt. That meant whoever was out there wasn't coming to save her. They were coming to finish the job. Jack clenched his jaw. He didn't know why she was important, but he knew one thing. If they got their hands on her, she wouldn't be leaving this planet alive. He turned back to the entrance. The soldiers were closing in. He counted at least 6, maybe more. They were moving in formation, careful, weapons ready. Trained killers. This wasn't a random patrol. Jack had a choice to make. He could leave her here, walk away, let them do whatever they came to do, and slip back toward human lines. He had no orders to protect an alien, and if his superiors found out what he was doing, he'd be branded a traitor. But something about this didn't sit right. He had spent years fighting in this war, but this was different. This wasn't a battle. This was an execution. The girl's breathing was growing unsteady again. She was trying to push herself up, but she was too weak. She needed help. Jack sighed. "I'm gonna regret this." He moved quickly, slinging his rifle over his shoulder before reaching down and grabbing her by the arm. She stiffened, eyes wide with panic, but he didn't give her time to react. "We're leaving," he said. She hesitated for only a second before nodding weakly. Jack pulled her up, supporting most of her weight as he led her toward the back of the bunker. There had to be another way out. If they went out the front, they'd be dead before they took 3 steps. The bunker was old, crumbling, but still solid enough to have a few hidden exits. He found one near the back, a rusted vent, large enough for them to squeeze through if they were fast. Jack turned to the girl. "Can you crawl?" She blinked at him, clearly not understanding the word. He sighed and pointed at the vent, then mimicked crawling with his hands. To his surprise, she managed a weak smirk. Human. Strange. "Yeah, well, humans have a habit of surviving," Jack muttered. She nodded once, then, with effort, dropped to her hands and knees and started crawling through the vent. Jack followed right behind her, his rifle slung across his back, his senses sharp. The distant sound of footsteps echoed through the bunker. The soldiers had arrived. Jack forced himself to stay calm. One wrong move, one sound, and they were dead. The girl moved as fast as she could, though it was clear she was struggling. Jack resisted the urge to push her forward. They had to stay quiet. They had to keep moving. Then suddenly, a loud clatter echoed from the main room. A metallic voice growled something in an alien language. A response came from another. They were searching. Jack kept moving. Almost there, the vent led to an opening near the side of a collapsed wall. If they could get through. Then the girl's hand slipped. Jack reached forward without thinking, grabbing her wrist before she could fall. She sucked in a sharp breath, but he held firm, pulling her forward. The voices behind them grew louder. Jack gritted his teeth. "Move!" She scrambled forward, pushing herself the last few feet. Jack followed, dragging himself through the opening just as the sound of a boot hitting metal rang out from inside the vent. They knew. Jack didn't stop to think. He grabbed the girl and hauled her to her feet, half carrying her as he broke into a run. Gunfire erupted behind them. Sparks flew as bullets struck the metal walls. Jack ducked low, pulling the girl with him, shielding her as they ran through the ruins. A ship loomed in the distance, a wreck, half buried in the dirt, but maybe intact enough to hide in. It was their only shot. "Hold on," Jack muttered. The girl barely had the strength to respond, but she clung to him as he pushed forward, sprinting toward whatever fate waited for them in the shadows of the wreck. Jack didn't stop running. His boots pounded against the cracked earth, his breath ragged, the weight of the alien girl pressing against his side. She was barely keeping up, her body weak, but she held on, her fingers gripping the fabric of his uniform like a lifeline. Behind them, the sound of gunfire echoed through the ruins. The enemy soldiers were closing in fast. Too fast. Jack's mind worked through the situation with military precision. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and stuck in enemy territory with no backup. His only advantage was that he knew how to disappear. If he could just reach the wreckage ahead, they might have a chance to regroup. The ship was massive, a long-dead relic of some forgotten battle. Its hull was torn open, jagged metal stretching toward the sky like broken ribs. Smoke and rust filled the air as Jack approached, scanning for a way inside. There, a narrow gap, just big enough for them to squeeze through. He didn't slow down. Jack ducked into the opening, pulling the girl in after him just as another burst of gunfire shattered the rocks where they had been standing seconds ago. Inside, the ship was dark, the stale air thick with dust. Wreckage was scattered across the floor, old consoles and broken machinery left to rot. Jack pressed himself against the wall, listening. The footsteps outside were getting closer. They had maybe seconds before the enemy found them. The girl stirred beside him, her breathing shaky. "No, safe," she whispered. Jack shot her a look. "Yeah, no kidding." She shook her head, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "They, not stop. They, hunt." Jack clenched his jaw. He didn't doubt it. He had seen elite kill squads before. Once they locked onto a target, they didn't stop until it was dead. That meant running wasn't an option. He had to fight. But not here. Not yet. Jack scanned the wreck, searching for something. Anything. They could use. The ship's interior was a mess. But up ahead, he spotted a door. It was barely hanging onto its hinges, but beyond it, he could make out what looked like an old maintenance shaft. If they could get through, they might be able to move deeper into the ship, find a better position to defend themselves. Jack grabbed the girl's arm, pulling her toward the door. She stumbled, still weak, but she followed. The moment they stepped inside, he shoved the rusted panel shut behind them, pressing his weight against it just as the first enemy soldier entered the wreckage outside. The girl tensed. She could hear them too. Jack raised a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet. Outside, the voices of the enemy soldiers carried through the wreckage, their harsh language sharp and commanding. They were searching, moving carefully, weapons ready. Jack held his breath as a shadow passed by the gap in the broken door. Then, silence. Too silent. Jack's gut twisted. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were tracking them. He could feel it. He moved fast. Grabbing the girl's wrist, he pulled her deeper into the shaft, guiding her through the twisted remains of the ship's corridors. The metal beneath their feet groaned with each step, but Jack didn't slow down. Behind them, something clicked. A mechanical sound, sharp and precise. Jack spun, instincts screaming. A red light flickered in the distance. A targeting scanner. Down. Jack tackled the girl just as a blast of energy ripped through the air, barely missing them. The heat scorched the wall beside them, melting metal on impact. They had drones. Jack rolled, pulling his rifle up in one smooth motion. He fired once, twice, his shots hitting the floating machine dead center. The drone sparked, shuddered, then collapsed in a heap of burning wreckage. But the damage was done. The enemy knew exactly where they were. The girl gasped, struggling to get up. Jack grabbed her arm and pulled her forward. Move. They ran, the narrow passageway twisting and turning, leading them deeper into the ship. Jack's mind raced. They couldn't keep running forever. They needed a plan. Then, up ahead, a light. Faint, flickering, but unmistakable. An exit. Jack surged forward, dragging the girl with him. They stumbled out onto another section of the wreckage, a wide open chamber lined with rusted crates and shattered cargo containers. The ceiling had collapsed in places, revealing glimpses of the dark sky above. Jack barely had a moment to process their surroundings before the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. The enemy was here. Jack cursed under his breath. He turned, raising his rifle, ready to fight, ready to make his last stand if he had to. But then, something unexpected happened. A voice crackled over his radio. Carter, if you find any alien survivors, eliminate them. Jack went rigid. His grip tightened around his weapon. His own people. His own command. They were looking for her too. The girl must have seen the change in his expression because she looked up at him, her glowing eyes filled with uncertainty. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Jack was caught between two enemies. And now he had a choice to make. Jack Carter stood frozen, the weight of his rifle heavier than it had ever felt. The message from his command still crackled in his ear, like an echo trapped in his mind. Carter, if you find any alien survivors, eliminate them. The girl beside him didn't speak, but her glowing eyes locked onto his, searching for something, an answer, a decision. Her breathing was unsteady, her body still weak from blood loss, yet she wasn't pleading. She wasn't begging for her life. She was just waiting. Jack's gut twisted. He had been a soldier for years, long enough to know orders weren't suggestions. He also knew that war had a way of making monsters out of men. His own people had given a kill-on-sight command. No capture, no negotiation, just execution. But why? Jack gritted his teeth. He didn't know who this girl really was, but he knew one thing. He had carried her through a war zone. He had watched her bleed. He had seen the fear in her eyes. And he had seen the soldiers hunting her, willing to burn everything down just to erase her existence. That wasn't war. That was something else. A shadow moved at the far end of the wreckage. Jack's grip on his rifle tightened. The enemy soldiers had caught up. He could see their silhouettes now, sleek armor blending into the darkness, weapons raised. There was no more time. Jack made his choice. He moved fast, grabbing the girl's wrist and yanking her behind a stack of rusted cargo crates just as gunfire erupted. Sparks flew as energy rounds tore through the metal, the force rattling the entire chamber. Jack pressed his back against the crate, pulling her close. "Stay down," he muttered. She nodded, her breathing shaky but controlled. Jack peeked out from cover, counting their numbers. 6 soldiers, maybe more. They moved with the precision of trained killers, sweeping the area, cutting off exits. A direct fight would be suicide. He needed another way out. His eyes flicked upward. Above them, near the collapsed ceiling, a broken catwalk stretched toward another exit. If they could climb up, they might be able to escape. But first, they had to survive the next 60 seconds. Jack reloaded his rifle. His ammo was low. 1 spare magazine left. No grenades, no backup, just his training and a girl who could barely stand. Great odds. The enemy was closing in. One soldier moved toward their position, scanning the crates with a sleek, high-tech visor. Jack knew what was coming. They had heat sensors. He and the girl were about to light up like flares. Jack exhaled slowly. Then he moved. In one fluid motion, he rolled out of cover, raised his rifle, and fired. The shot struck the soldier dead center, sending him crashing to the ground. Before the others could react, Jack was already moving, grabbing a broken metal pipe from the debris and hurling it toward a nearby console. The impact sent a screeching echo through the chamber, throwing off the enemy's aim. Then he turned back to the girl. "Go." She hesitated, her glowing eyes flickering with uncertainty. Jack didn't have time for hesitation. He grabbed her arm and pushed her toward the ladder leading up to the catwalk. "Climb." She obeyed, dragging herself up rung by rung, her weakened body trembling with the effort. Jack stayed at the base, covering her ascent. The enemy had regrouped, adjusting to the ambush, and now they were coming fast. Jack fired another shot, taking down a second soldier. His rifle clicked empty, out of ammo. No time to reload. A soldier lunged at him, blade flashing. Jack dodged, twisting his body as the blade sliced past his ribs, cutting fabric but missing flesh. He countered with a brutal strike to the soldier's throat, then grabbed the man's sidearm as he collapsed. A second enemy charge. Jack barely got the stolen pistol up in time. 2 shots to the chest. The soldier went down. Jack didn't wait for the next one. He grabbed the ladder and climbed. Above him, the girl had reached the catwalk, but she was struggling to move, gripping the railing for support. Jack climbed faster, adrenaline fueling every motion. A bullet whizzed past his head, striking the metal beside him. The enemy was firing up at them now. Jack reached the top and pulled himself over just as another shot grazed his shoulder. Pain burned through his arm, but he ignored it. He grabbed the girl's wrist and pulled her toward the exit. They were almost there. Then a voice stopped them. "Carter." Jack turned. His stomach sank. At the far end of the catwalk, standing with a rifle aimed straight at him, was another soldier. But not just any soldier. Lieutenant Briggs, Jack's commanding officer. Jack's grip tightened around his stolen pistol, but Briggs didn't fire. He just stood there, watching, his expression unreadable. Jack knew that look. It was the look of a man given an order he wasn't sure he wanted to follow. Briggs exhaled through his nose. "You have one chance to do the right thing, Sergeant." Jack didn't move. Neither did the girl. Briggs's voice was calm, steady. "You know the orders. We don't take prisoners. We don't leave witnesses." He nodded toward the girl. "Step aside, Carter. Let's end this." Jack's heart pounded. His mind raced through options, but there weren't many. Briggs wasn't an idiot. If Jack hesitated too long, he'd take the shot himself. Jack glanced at the girl. She was watching him again, but this time there was no question in her eyes, just acceptance. She knew. She knew what this war was. Jack clenched his jaw. Briggs's finger moved toward the trigger. Jack made his choice. He shot first. The bullet struck Briggs in the shoulder, sending him stumbling back. Before he could recover, Jack grabbed the girl and sprinted for the exit. Behind them, Briggs shouted something. Maybe a warning, maybe a curse, but Jack didn't care. He didn't stop. They reached the edge of the catwalk and leaped. The ground came fast. Jack twisted his body, taking most of the impact as they hit the floor and rolled. His shoulder screamed in pain, but he didn't slow down. He pulled the girl up, and together, they ran into the darkness. Gunfire erupted behind them, but they were already gone. Jack had just crossed a line. There was no going back now. Jack Carter ran, his breath heavy, the searing pain in his shoulder threatening to slow him down. He didn't let it. He couldn't afford to. The girl stumbled beside him, her weakened body barely keeping up, but she pushed forward, gripping his arm as they weaved through the wreckage. Behind them, gunfire echoed through the ruined ship, but the enemy was falling behind. For now. They crashed through a jagged opening in the hull, emerging into the cold night air. Smoke and fire still lingered from earlier battles, the sky above filled with distant streaks of ships engaging in combat miles away. Jack didn't stop moving. The enemy wouldn't give up that easily. Briggs wouldn't give up that easily. He dragged the girl toward the rocky outcroppings beyond the crash site. The terrain was rough, uneven, but it was cover. A place to vanish, a place to think. They collapsed behind a jagged boulder, Jack pressing his back against the stone, forcing himself to take slow, steady breaths. His wound throbbed, but it wasn't fatal. Not yet. He looked at the girl. She was trembling, her glowing eyes unfocused, but she was alive. That counted for something. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of ships and the crackling of dying fires. Then, finally, she turned her gaze to him. "You, not kill," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack huffed out a tired breath. "No, I didn't." She studied him, her expression unreadable. "Why?" Jack didn't answer right away. He wasn't even sure he had an answer. He had followed orders his entire life, done what needed to be done to survive this war. But something about this, about her, was different. He didn't know why, but he knew he couldn't just stand by and let it happen. Instead of answering, he leaned his head back against the rock, closing his eyes for a second. "You gonna tell me why they want you dead?" Silence stretched between them. He could feel her hesitation, the weight of whatever truth she was holding back. Then, finally, she spoke. "My people." "No war," she said, her voice thick with exhaustion. "Not want fight." Jack frowned. "Could have fooled me. Your soldiers have been tearing through our forces for years." She shook her head. "Not my people. My father." She paused, swallowing hard. "King. He. Peace. War. Not him." Jack's eyebrows lifted slightly. King. So she really was royalty. He had suspected as much, but hearing her say it made it real. She continued, her words coming slowly, as if every sentence cost her something. "Others wanted war, made war. Lies." Her eyes darkened, and for a moment, he could see the anger beneath the exhaustion. "They kill him, kill family, take throne." She exhaled shakily. "I escape." Jack sat in silence, processing. If what she was saying was true, then this war wasn't what it seemed. It wasn't just humans and aliens locked in an endless fight. It was something deeper, something orchestrated. It explained why she was being hunted, why her own people weren't trying to rescue her. She was a threat to the ones in power. Jack exhaled sharply, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "So let me get this straight. Your father was trying to stop the war. Some bastards didn't like that. They killed him. And now they're making sure you don't live long enough to do anything about it." She nodded weakly. Jack sighed. "Great. So I just pissed off not one, but two armies for you." A small, tired smile flickered across her face. "Yes." Jack shook his head, letting out a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, that tracks." He rubbed at his eyes, exhaustion creeping in. He had no idea what the hell to do next. He couldn't go back to his own forces, not after shooting Briggs. The enemy was hunting them both, and now he was stuck in the middle of a conspiracy he didn't ask for. Fantastic. The girl shifted beside him, her body still weak, but there was a new resolve in her eyes now. "I must go home," she murmured. "Must stop them." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Yeah. And how exactly do you plan on doing that?" "Walk up to your planet's front door and ask nicely." She hesitated, then slowly shook her head. "Need proof. Need truth." Jack sighed, leaning back against the rock again. "Right. And let me guess. You expect me to help you with that?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Jack stared at the dark sky, his jaw tightening. This wasn't his fight. It had never been his fight. He could still walk away. He could disappear, find a way back to human territory, and let the war play out however it was going to play out. But deep down, he already knew he wasn't going to do that. Jack Carter had spent years following orders, fighting battles for reasons he didn't fully understand. For the first time in his life, he had a choice. And he had already made it. He pushed himself up, rolling his injured shoulder with a wince. "All right, princess," he muttered. "Looks like we're both fugitives now." She looked up at him, her glowing eyes watching him closely. Jack smirked. "Let's go steal ourselves a ship." Jack Carter crouched in the shadows of the rocky outcrop, his rifle steady in his grip as he surveyed the valley below. Nestled between jagged cliffs, an enemy forward base hummed with activity, glowing red and blue lights flickering along its perimeter. Several ships were docked at the landing pad, sleek and deadly, guarded by soldiers who moved with precision. His mind worked through the situation, cataloging every potential threat, every route in and out. Stealing the ship wasn't impossible, but it was damn close. Beside him, the alien princess, Carrie, sat with her back against the rock, her glowing eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. She had recovered slightly, but she was still too weak to fight. Not that it mattered. This was Jack's mess to handle. He exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. "This is suicide." Carrie tilted her head slightly. "Suicide," she repeated, struggling with the word. Jack shook his head. "Nothing. Just means I'm about to do something really, really stupid." She studied him for a moment before speaking again, her voice quiet but steady. "You do not have to help." Jack let out a humorless chuckle. "You think I don't know that?" He sighed, looking down at the base again. "I should have walked away when I had the chance. Instead, I shot my own CO and pissed off half the galaxy." He shook his head, muttering under his breath. Hell of a day. A long silence stretched between them. Then, Carrie shifted slightly, her gaze locked onto him. "Why?" Jack frowned. "Why what?" "Why not leave?" Jack didn't have an answer. At first, it had been instinct. He couldn't just leave someone wounded behind, not when she had been hunted like an animal. But now, after everything, it was more than that. Maybe he was just tired of being a pawn in someone else's war. Instead of answering, he nodded toward the base. "There's a ship. It's small, but it'll get us off this rock." Carrie followed his gaze, her glowing eyes narrowing. "Many guards?" "Yeah. We're gonna have to cause a little chaos." Jack checked his rifle, making sure his stolen sidearm was loaded. "I can handle a few distractions, but I need you to get to that ship while I keep them busy." Carrie hesitated, shaking her head. "I am not strong." "You don't need to be. Just don't get shot." She gave him a tired look, clearly unimpressed with his plan. Jack just smirked. "Trust me, I've done dumber things." Carrie took a slow breath, then nodded. "I trust." Jack blinked. He hadn't expected that. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to focus. "All right. Get ready." He moved quickly, slipping down the rocky slope, keeping to the shadows. His pulse was steady, his instincts sharp. He had done this before. Covert ops, sabotage, playing the ghost in enemy territory. This wasn't any different. Except this time, he wasn't doing it for his own people. He reached the outer edge of the base, pressing himself against the cooled metal of a supply crate. The soldiers patrolling the perimeter were armored and heavily armed. Too many to take in a direct fight. He needed something bigger. His eyes flicked to the fuel station near the shipyard. Bingo! Jack pulled a stolen grenade from his belt, yanking the pin with his teeth. He took a breath, counted to 3, then tossed it. The explosion ripped through the air, a fireball consuming the station as soldiers shouted in alarm. The base immediately went into chaos, sirens blaring as emergency protocols kicked in. Jack grinned. That'll do it. Then he ran. Gunfire erupted behind him, soldiers scrambling to respond to the attack. Jack darted between cover, taking quick, precise shots to keep them distracted. He had no intention of winning this fight, just buying time. Across the yard, Carrie was moving, slipping between the shadows like a ghost. She wasn't fast, but she was careful. Smart. She reached the nearest ship, her hands shaking as she worked at the control panel. Jack just had to hold out a little longer. A bullet clipped his shoulder, sending a jolt of pain down his arm. He stumbled, barely managing to dive behind a stack of crates before another volley of fire rained down on his position. Briggs was here. Jack's stomach clenched as he saw his former commander striding through the chaos, his rifle raised. His voice was sharp, cutting through the noise. "Carter, you don't walk away from this. Stand down." Jack spat blood onto the dirt, smirking despite the pain. "That's the thing, Briggs. I already did." Briggs' face hardened. "This war isn't yours to fight." Jack shook his head. "It never was." Briggs didn't hesitate. He fired. Jack barely dodged in time, rolling behind cover as the shots shredded through the metal. He was outgunned, outnumbered, and running out of options. Then the engines roared to life. Jack's head snapped toward the landing pad. Carrie had done it. The ship was powering up, its thrusters humming as the landing gear unlocked. Briggs realized it too. "Damn it," he snarled, turning his rifle toward the ship. Jack moved without thinking. He lunged from cover, tackling Briggs just as he fired. The shot went wide, missing the ship by inches. The two men crashed to the ground, rolling across the dirt in a brutal struggle. Briggs was bigger, stronger, but Jack had nothing to lose. He fought dirty, slamming an elbow into Briggs' ribs before wrenching the rifle from his hands. Briggs gasped in pain, but his expression remained cold. "This won't change anything." Jack leveled the gun at him. "Maybe not, but it's a damn good start." He didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he turned and ran. The ship's ramp was already lowering. Carrie was inside, reaching out for him. Jack sprinted, gunfire exploding behind him as soldiers scrambled to stop them. The moment his boots hit the ramp, Carrie slammed the controls, sealing the hatch. Jack barely made it to the cockpit before the ship lurched upward, thrusters igniting. Carrie struggled with the controls, her hands shaking, but Jack reached over, steadying them. "Breathe," he muttered. She nodded, inhaling sharply. The ship shot forward, breaking free of the atmosphere, engines roaring as they tore away from the planet. Jack let out a long breath, slumping back in his seat. Carrie turned to him, eyes wide, disbelieving. We live." Jack grinned, despite the pain in his ribs. "For now." She swallowed, looking out at the vast expanse of space before them. "Where? Now?" Jack leaned back, staring at the endless stars. He had no home to go back to, no orders to follow, no war to fight. For the first time in his life, he was free. He smirked. "Wherever the hell we want."